Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. On March 1st, 1979, the PLA's 446th Regiment came late to the really lousy party called the Sino-Vietnamese War. They came to lend a hand in northwest Vietnam, the same neighborhood as the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which we'll talk about in a mini-series later. They expected to sail through, but instead they got dropped promptly right into the soup by a simple map reading error. They were assigned to attack the gorgeous, remote hill town of Sapa, not far from Lao Cai, where their PLA brothers had already fought a hard 2 weeks just to make a small indentation into Vietnamese lines. And now the newly arrived 149th Division was ordered to make a night march and cross one of the two bridges into the town of Sapa. They were told that their jumping off point for their attack in the morning would be bridge number 4, one of just two routes in and out of Sapa. And this bridge was supposedly held by friendly PLA forces who were waiting for the 446th and their parent division to come through and march across into enemy territory come morning, so that in the morning they could move across the bridge, fan out into battle formation, and attack the town of Sapa. There was one key piece of information they didn't know. Bridge number 4, it was not in friendly hands. But believing that it was held by their friends, they came jogging in formation up to Bridge 4. And in the gloom, they saw sentries, who they assumed were Chinese soldiers guarding the bridge, and hailed them to exchange passwords. You can imagine how surprised they were when the sentries exchanged with them not a counter password, but a burst of automatic fire that cut down two of the 446 men right away. With that, pandemonium broke out. All along the road that the regiment had approached on, gunfire now broke out because they were in enemy territory, and the sound of shooting at the bridge was waking up Vietnamese posts all along the highway that they'd been marching down. Here's the even worse part. At this point, the regiment's lead element, 5th Company, still did not understand that the bridge that they were trying to use was not in friendly hands. Somehow, they believed that the resistance that they were encountering was just a group of enemy stragglers. They didn't yet know that they were facing a heavily armed garrison of guard troops at that bridge. They just figured these stragglers, they might be unusually scrappy, but they just muscle them aside and march across the bridge as planned. It was only after 5th Company got across the bridge that they understood that they had actually put their neck into a noose. Because as they reached the far side of the bridge, a red rocket flare went up from some enemy position around them, and it flew up and lit up the sky and made clear that they were standing at the bottom of a great big cavernous bowl of high points all around them. And then fire rained down from them from heavy machine guns, light machine guns, mortars, recoilless rockets, and those awful anti-aircraft guns that were being depressed and used as anti-personnel lawnmowers. These anti-aircraft cannons were the scourge of the Sino-Vietnamese War for both sides, because both sides' units had organic anti-air capability. But both the Chinese and the Vietnamese militaries had this unspoken gentleman's agreement that they were not going to use air power in this war. However ugly it got, they were going to keep it limited to a ground war. So now both the armies had these quad-mounted dushkas sitting idle. They had no aircraft to defend against, so that gave them plenty of time to get creative about how to use those cannon as human weed whackers. So it was only now, after Fifth Company had gotten across this bridge into the very belly of the enemy, that they understood that there had been a very serious intelligence failure. And they were standing below so many Vietnamese heavy weapons that the Vietnamese mortar crews probably didn't even need mortar tubes. They could just like lean over a cliffside and drop a mortar round onto the Chinese forces below. By now, it was much too late for them to boogie back across the bridge. In fact, it was too late for their whole battalion lined up behind them to get out of this ambush. So at this point, throughout the column, word spreads. They've strayed into enemy territory. And the word went out for Fifth Company to get to some kind of higher ground before, as one Chinese account puts it, they got wrapped up like a wonton. There was only one good piece of news for Fifth Company stuck on the other side of the bridge, and that is that the Seventh Company was stuck with them. When the firing broke out at first, and the battalion slowly became aware that they were actually fighting a vastly superior Vietnamese host, the Seventh Company did the doctrinal thing and they ran forward to try to get out of the kill zone. And I suspect they didn't have much choice. Going backward probably wasn't an option because they had the rest of the battalion and the rest of the regiment lined up in column behind them. So they too charged across bridge number 4 with Fifth Company. So at least if you're going to be trapped in enemy territory under an arsenal of guns that practically reads like a catalog of Soviet heavy weapons, you might as well have friends with you. So since the imperative now is get out of that awful valley floor, Fifth Company and Seventh Company turn left, and everybody is going to have to climb like hell up this slope. It's going to suck, especially because they're just two companies on their own. And even if they make it to the top of that hill and somehow they can take it away from God knows who is up there, they're still going to be alone, separated from their regiment on the other side of that cursed bridge. But at least they'll be up high where maybe they can only be shot at from 2 or 3 directions. And they'll have each other, because plucky little Seventh Company is doing its darndest to help Fifth Company, that advanced guard who's stuck way out in front, to help them get out of the soup, because this whole time they've been more exposed than anybody else. And they took their first 2 casualties in the first second of this engagement when they got shot up by those sentries who they thought were friendly. So Seventh Company really goes out of its way to spare Fifth Company some of the mauling and help cover them as they move up this slope. So in particular, this one light machine gunner from Seventh Company, a Tibetan guy named Jia, takes his Type 56 light machine gun, which is an RPD, a Degtyaryov, which the PLA loved. And he works his way up the slope to a big rock that's going to shield him. And he mounts his RPD on there and he starts rocking and rolling to give breathing space to Fifth Company so they can get up off the ground and start to move up the slope. Now, I got to stop here for a minute and just point out that, especially in this part of the PLA in the Southwest, diversity really was their strength, to borrow a phrase. That part of China was and is highly multi-ethnic. And say what you will about Han majority chauvinism and maybe patronizing of the PRC's minority ethnicities, be that as it may, in this southwestern theater of the PLA, where the units are drawn from Yunnan and Guangxi and Sichuan and Eastern Tibet, the PLA really was a happy, clappy rainbow of ethnic diversity. So, for example, in our last episode, when we talked about Yenlong, the famous one-man SKS wrecking crew, it's telling that in his rifle squad of 10 men, there were 9 ethnicities represented. So, the Tibetan machine gunner, Jia is doing the Lord's work with that RPD, or at least he's doing Deng Xiaoping's work. And poor, long-suffering Fifth Company is finally starting to pry free and inch their way up this slope. Well, great! Once they get there, All they have to do is dislodge a bunch of enemy machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles, and then they can relax and enjoy being trapped behind enemy lines because of someone else's map reading error. Hooray! Problem is, when Jiaduo opens up with that light machine gun, all the enemy heavy weapons around decide that he is a problem and must be blotted out. So all of a sudden now, Jiaduo, this one guy, gets targeted by mortars and a recoilless rifle, which is to say, really a small anti-tank rocket, and he gets blown up. So now, Fifth Company is pinned down again. And after several minutes of this, there's one of those momentary lulls in the fighting when one voice breaks out. It's the Fifth Company CO yelling desperately, covering fire, covering fire. Where are my machine guns? Then something incredible happens. People see Jiaduo, the Tibetan machine gunner, who's supposed to be dead. He sits upright like he's back from the dead. He's got 5 shrapnel wounds from that rocket explosion, but he's still alive. And when the CO was yelling for machine guns, that penetrated his unconscious brain, and he sat up. They needed him. So he's ready to get back in the fight. But the problem is, when he was blown up and went unconscious, his RPD slid a ways down the slope. So people see him heave this big breath and then crawl out from behind his boulder that's covering him down to the RPD where he's now exposed. So then, incredibly, he stands up with the RPD Rambo style and like John Wayne's it from the crook of his arm, firing again to cover Fifth Company. Well, of course, he's a target again now, and people around him see him get transfixed through the chest by rifle bullets. But they say that miraculously, he stayed upright for a while and continued this one long string of fire before he finally fell dead, really dead, with his barrel glowing red hot. And in fact, later, when they recovered Jiaduo's body, his left arm was not just burned, but scorched, charred, cooked, 焦糊了. The barrel had been so hot, it had just cooked right through his uniform and his flesh. Please, somebody get this guy a First Order of Merit. Well, through heroism like this, somehow, Fifth and Seventh Companies actually made it off the X, up onto some high ground, and dug in.
The following exclusive visual aid is classified top secret.
Friends, this is a top secret battle map that I was able to have smuggled out of the archives in Beijing. Some people might think that this is not a genuine battle map, but I assure you, good men died getting this to you. Under no circumstances should you reveal to anyone outside of our YouTube channel that I have this, or I will be targeted for assassination by the Second Directorate. Here we see where Fifth and Seventh Companies ended up taking a little piece of high ground because they ended up alone on the unfriendly side of the bridge, surrounded by evil Vietnamese positions. This is the handy Soviet map symbol for mortars. And then here's the rest of 2nd Battalion, who then gets heat from these huge Vietnamese positions and from some straggler Vietnamese units on their own side of the stream, and they end up going to ground and basically being pinned down.
End of top secret visual aid. We now rejoin our episode in progress. Remember, friends, that if I die of polonium toxicity, it was definitely Beijing.
Now, the Chinese really couldn't be in a worse position, except that technically they do have a foothold on the other side of the bridge. And that changed the complexion of this battle. So far in this war, PLA commanders were not covering themselves in glory at the higher levels of leadership. There's one school of thought that we'll talk about another time that says that PLA officers were superbly adaptive in this war at the company level or below, maybe even the battalion level, but that there was some systematic and decisive failure of the officers at the higher levels of command. However, the 149th Division and its parent corps, 50 Corps, was a little different. Their deputy corps commander was an animal named Liu Guangtong, just a senior colonel, but he had done about as much fighting as it's humanly possible to fit into 58 years. And he was exactly the kind of field commander that the PLE needed on a shambolic night like this. Liu was grossly underranked. He had spent something like 20 years as just a senior colonel and a divisional commander. See our video on PLA ranks elsewhere. And considering that he had just jaw-dropping combat experience in both mountains and jungles, it's a wonder that he wasn't more highly distinguished. Now, there are reasons for that too, and we can discuss them another time. But the very short version is that the PLA had gotten very top heavy with these old warhorse senior colonels scarred by 1,000 battles, who were really a dime a dozen now. So for all Leo's combat experience, his only like real special status was that he was one of only two people in the whole army who didn't have to salute anyone. And that was because he had been wounded so many times that there was nothing left of his right hand except for a thumb and a forefinger. And so the story is that one day he was in a meeting with Zhou Enlai, the premier, and Liu tried to give him a salute with his little like rump stump right hand. And Zhou turned to the room and said, "New rule. Senior Colonel Liu never has to salute anyone." Well, on that rainy night in 1979, atop that bullet-soaked hilltop in Vietnam, Liu Guangtong was exactly the leader you'd want. Now, I'm no expert on Soviet tactics, but to my mind, what he did next looks more like the Soviet manual than the PLA one. From that vantage point, what Liu had was perhaps a classic setup for success or a breakthrough, namely a regiment whose advance guard had had a meeting engagement and felt its way through a crack in the enemy's defenses and achieved a lodgment. So from that perspective, it was pretty obvious what Liu ought to do next, namely take his heaviest, fastest moving subunits and organize them into a little quick reaction force and then punch them through that opening and create a breakthrough. So Liu had the regimental commander hustle his heavy weapons companies to reinforce the bridgehead. And then he sent the division's tank element barreling down the road behind them. So as you can see, this night may have started as a little stumble in the jungle with a PLA infantry company that was actually jogging on a rural road in formation. But now it had escalated into a large-scale mechanized battle of regiments and division, with both sides sprinting forward their heaviest forces to try to grab this bridge. And the PLA was losing that race because while they currently had some infantry lying face down in mud on both sides of the bridge, suddenly a Vietnamese platoon of four T-34 tanks shows up at the bridge. If they crossed that bridge, they were just going to drive over 2nd Battalion's riflemen on the ground like peanut shells on a barroom floor. Worse still, if the tanks destroyed that bridge, 5th and 7th companies would be lost forever. And the Chinese 2nd Battalion CO was watching helplessly from his side of the bridge. He did what he could. He called some RPG crews forward to shoot at the Vietnamese tanks from across the river with their RPGs. That didn't do anything. All that happened was the Vietnamese T-34 Elephants ignored the RPGs, and Vietnamese machine guns from the heights just hosed down the RPG crews. There's a surviving Chinese veteran from that 2nd Battalion who said that they thought that they were dead for sure. And just instead of lie there passively and wait to get squished by the tanks, they were gathering together grenades and satchel charges for when the tanks crossed the bridge and got right on top of them, and they would take some with them. And he specifically recalls that while they were doing that, ordnance was hitting the ground, the wet, soppy ground around them so plentifully that he said it was hard to keep your eyes open because of all the airborne mud being sprayed around at ground level. Then, while all this terror is going on, still in the black of night, there came this Saving Private Ryan moment when this prostrate infantryman said he heard tank engines from behind them. And he turned, and they were Chinese T-54s racing up to them. And he said, next thing he knew, there was this old man with one arm crouching down next to him. It was Liu Guangtong, the deputy corps commander himself. And this veteran said that Liu shouted to him, "Advance with the tanks. The faster you move, the safer you are." Once they approached the river, they started shooting at the T-34s from across the river to keep them away from the bridge. And then behind the tanks rolled up the anti-aircraft guns that were fast becoming the superstars of this war. So those Chinese AAA guns unlimbered around the Chinese side of the bridge, and they start playing close range dueling dushkas with the Vietnamese AAA guns up on the hilltops around them, where they were led by none other than the regimental commander, Cao Tonglian himself. So here's this colonel standing amid machine gun fire, and the MPs who are assigned to protect him are going bananas. They're repeatedly grabbing him and trying to drag him off bodily to somewhere safer, but he's intent on other things. And so he's just like wordlessly peeling their gropey hands off him until finally he just loses his shizzle and he screams at them, "I have troops dying here and I'm not leaving them. Touch me again and I'll shoot you myself." Friends, because this story is getting long, I'm going to pause here and pick it up in a second part, which I'll release very promptly. I'll see you on the other side of that break.